Antonio Montana.
All I have in this world is my balls and my word, and I don't break them for no one.
Who put this thing together? Me! That's who!
You need people like me so you can point your fingers and say, that's the bad guy.
Yeah, what was coming to me?
Oh, what was coming to you, Tom?
The world, Chico. And everything in it.
When Scarface hit theaters in 1983, it didn't just introduce audiences to Tony Montana, it redefined the American crime drama. Directed by Brian De Palma and written by Oliver Stone, the film took the template of a 1930s gangster story and injected it with a raw, violent intensity that spoke to a whole new generation.
What the is wrong with this guy? Am I kidding me or what?
Just answer the questions, Tony.
With Al Pacino in the lead role, dripping in sweat and fury, Scarface became a cultural lightning rod, reviled by critics, embraced by audiences, and ultimately cemented as one of the most iconic films in cinema history. But what's astonishing is how little of its deeper story is truly understood. Beneath the machine guns and the cocaine, behind the now legendary one-liners, there's a web of symbolism, hidden character choices, and personal struggles that even die-hard fans often miss.
A piece of shit up there, I never liked him. I never trusted him.
Over the years, the cast and crew have dropped clues in interviews, behind-the-scenes commentary, and rare public appearances, giving hints about what really went down during the making of the film and what they intended that never made it to the surface.
You know what? You should listen to your wife, man. She's right. You are an asshole, man.
Take Al Pacino, for example. His obsession with the role was all-consuming. He wasn't just playing Tony Montana, he was becoming him. But most fans don't know that during early production, Pacino suffered a serious hand injury from a mishandled prop gun, causing delays and intense on-set tension, or that he insisted on basing Tony's accent not on Cuban stereotypes, but on specific, real-life figures he studied in Miami, people whose identities remain mostly unknown to this day. And then there's Michelle, cast as Elvira Hancock.
How dare you talk to me like that? What makes you so much better than me?
Her performance exudes cold detachment and elegance, but off-screen, it was anything but smooth. Pfeiffer was a virtual unknown at the time and faced skepticism from nearly everyone involved. In later years, she admitted that during filming, she was starving herself to maintain Elvira's ultra-thin appearance, unaware that her own health was slipping. Her portrayal wasn't just an act, it was the result of brutal physical and emotional pressure that shaped every scene she was in.
You want a kid?
Delaware.
What kind of a father do you think?
But perhaps most mysterious of all is the coded symbolism scattered throughout the film, intentional details that only a few cast members have ever discussed. For instance, the constant presence of surveillance cameras in background shots, the mirrored interiors of Tony's mansion, or the repeated use of the flamingo motif. According to cast interviews from a 20th anniversary panel, these weren't just stylistic choices. They were cues, embedded signals about Tony's mental state, his paranoia, and his self-destruction. The truth, they say, is that Scarface was never meant to be just a crime saga. It was a character study about the cost of delusion and the American dream's inevitable collapse.
Like all those other people, man?
I don't have to listen to this.
One of the most fascinating revelations came from Stephen Bauer, who played Manny Ribera, Tony's best friend and eventual victim.
Man, that's the boss's lady, okay? We're gonna get us killed already.
You, man, the bossy lady.
In interviews, years later, Bauer revealed that many of his scenes with Pacino were improvised or loosely scripted. The chemistry between them wasn't entirely an act. They had developed a close bond during production, and that emotional intimacy bled into their performances. But Bauer also confessed something darker, that he saw the betrayal coming, not in the script, but in the subtext. He noticed how Tony's eyes would linger just a little too long on Elvira, how the possessiveness toward Manny felt increasingly unstable. It wasn't just brotherly love, it was domination. Bauer also talked about the cultural weight of the film, especially in the Cuban-American community. Many people assumed he and Pacino were Cuban, but only Bauer actually was. This mattered. In fact, there was tension behind the scenes over the film's portrayal of Cuban immigrants as criminals. Some advocacy groups pushed back hard, and the cast was caught in the middle. Pacino, Stone, and De Palma defended the film's intent, that it was a metaphor, not a documentary. But Bauer, in private, admitted that the backlash hit close to home. He felt torn between pride in the role and the discomfort of being a face for something that misrepresented so many people. Then there's the house. Tony Montana's mansion is one of the most memorable sets in movie history, from the gold-plated bathtubs to the massive portrait of himself hanging in the foyer. But here's what fans rarely catch. Every room in that house is a reflection of Tony's unraveling mind. According to the production designer, the layout was deliberately designed to feel more like a prison than a palace. There are no soft lines, no warm lighting. Everything is angular, cold, hard. Even the famous grand staircase, the one Tony dies on, was inspired by ancient temples where kings were sacrificed. The message? Tony didn't build a home, he built a tomb. Over the years, De Palma and Stone have both commented on the dual meaning of the film's most quoted line, "Say hello to my little friend." On the surface, it's pure bravado, a gangster unleashing his fury. But Oliver Stone later revealed it was also a moment of tragic irony. Tony, by that point, that gun, his so-called little friend, was the only companion he had left. Stone said he wrote the line not as a joke, but as a cry for help. A final, desperate act of a man who had climbed to the top, only to find there was no one left beside him. Even minor characters carry hidden weight. Gina Montana, Tony's sister, played by Mary Elizabeth Mastrantonio, is often remembered for the shocking final act, her death, Tony's guilt, the emotional explosion that leads to his own demise. But Mastrantonio revealed in later interviews that she and Pacino worked together on a backstory never shown on screen. Gina wasn't just Tony's sister, she was his mirror, his last remaining piece of innocence. The overprotectiveness he showed wasn't just about control, it was about shame. Tony, deep down, saw in her the life he could never have.
Oh, Tony.
Her death wasn't just tragic, it was the final symbol of his moral collapse. Another layer many fans overlook is the way the film handles language, not just the accent or the slang, but the deliberate distortion of the American dream through speech. Tony Montana arrives in the US barely speaking English.
And my father, he was from the United States.
Yet every step he takes up the criminal ladder is marked by how fluently he begins to mimic American ambition. Not morality, not values, just ambition. Al Pacino explained in a rare interview that Tony's English wasn't meant to improve cleanly over time. It was fractured for a reason, to show how he absorbed the words of success without ever understanding their meaning. By the end, he speaks like an American businessman, but his soul remains trapped in the fear and fury of the streets he came from. One of the film's most subtle moments comes early on, in the refugee camp under the Miami sun, when Tony first lays eyes on the world he wants. The camera holds just a few seconds longer than necessary on his face. That wasn't in the script. Pacino improvised it. The director let it roll. And in that silent beat, you can see everything: envy, calculation, hunger. De Palma would later say it was the real birth of Tony Montana, the moment the mask first formed. He wasn't reacting to the world. He was studying it, decoding its weakness, deciding how to exploit it. The violence in Scarface has often been criticized for being excessive, but few realize how carefully it was choreographed. The infamous chainsaw scene, for instance, was shot in a real apartment in Miami, and the tension on set was palpable. The cast knew something special was happening, but they also knew it came at a cost. That scene haunted them for months. Behind the camera, Oliver Stone was fighting demons of his own. When he wrote Scarface, he was deep in the throes of his cocaine addiction. He's been open about it since. The paranoia, the desperation, the illusion of power. It wasn't fiction, it was confession. Stone later said that writing Tony Montana was like staring into a mirror and seeing the devil grin back. The script's fury wasn't crafted, it was bled onto the page. That's why it resonates, that's why it hurts. Because it was never just about drugs or money. It was about obsession and the kind of hunger that eats a man from the inside out. And that theme, the internal collapse, is echoed visually throughout the film. Take the color palette. Early scenes are awash in sunlight, beaches, soft blues and tans. But as Tony rises, the palette darkens. Reds and blacks dominate. Shadows grow. By the end, he lives in a fortress of marble and blood, where every corner is either cold or burning. The set design team said it was no accident. Every color shift was meant to show Tony's moral decay. The brighter the world became outside, his mansion, the darker his world turned within it. The soundtrack of Scarface is another element that hides meaning in plain sight. Giorgio Moroder's electronic score feels dated to some modern viewers, but it was groundbreaking at the time. More than that, it was symbolic. The synthetic, pulsing rhythms were chosen to reflect Tony's synthetic version of the American dream, artificial, mechanical, and ultimately hollow. Moroder even used the tempo of the music to reflect Tony's mental state. As his empire grows, the score speeds up. As paranoia sets in, the tones get sharper, more anxious. By the final act, the music is practically screaming beneath the surface, like Tony's mind tearing apart. There's also the matter of who isn't in the movie. Fans often focus on Tony, Elvira, Manny, the big loud players. But screenwriter Oliver Stone originally included more women in the story. There were to be female rivals, mentors, and foils for Tony, characters who could see through him or stand up to him. But studio pressures and time constraints trimmed the script down, and many of those roles vanished. Michelle Pfeiffer even hinted in later years that Elvira was once written with a much stronger arc, not just a trophy, but a threat, someone who might have left Tony first. That version never made it to screen, but echoes of it remain in her cold detachment and cutting remarks. What's most chilling is how much of Tony's downfall is telegraphed, scene by scene, if you know where to look. In an early moment, he dismisses a partner's caution with the line, "You gotta make the money first. It's meant to be confident." But the way Pacino delivers it, fast, clipped, almost defensive, shows it's not wisdom, it's insecurity. The cast has said that Tony was never meant to be cool. He was meant to look cool to people who misunderstood the message. That's the irony. For years, fans idolized Tony Montana. The cast, they pitied him, they feared him, and they never meant for him to be a hero. In fact, Robert Loggia, who played Frank Lopez, Tony's first mentor and eventual victim, said that one of the most overlooked scenes in the film is their first meeting. Frank is calm, measured, almost friendly. He doesn't shout, he doesn't threaten, but there's a warning buried in every word. Loggia explained that Frank saw what Tony was from the start, a bomb waiting to go off. His performance was deliberately understated to contrast with Tony's wildness. But fans rarely talk about Frank, because in the mythos of Scarface, restraint doesn't sell. The tragedy, Loggia said, is that Frank's death is the moment the film loses its only chance at stability. Then comes the rise. Quick, violent, unstoppable. One montage shows Tony's empire expanding. Clubs, cash, cars. But buried in that montage is a moment that most people miss. It's a shot of Tony sitting alone at a desk, surrounded by opulence, his eyes empty. It lasts barely 2 seconds. No dialogue, just silence. According to the editors, that shot almost didn't make the final cut. But Pacino insisted. He wanted a moment to show that even as Tony wins, he's already lost. That's the genius of the film. It hides moments of psychological collapse in the middle of the action, trusting the audience to catch them. Most don't. The final act of Scarface is a storm of violence, but within that storm, there are moments of haunting stillness. One of them comes just before the chaos erupts, when Tony is slumped in his office, numb, staring at the television as the surveillance feeds flicker across the screen. The world is watching him, and he's watching himself. The cast later revealed that the set was intentionally designed to mimic the feeling of a surveillance room. Sterile, claustrophobic, overexposed. Al Pacino said that in those moments, Tony isn't a king anymore. He's a prisoner of his own paranoia, locked inside a fortress of fear. Every camera is a mirror, every screen a reminder of the empire he built on blood and betrayal. There's also the infamous "the world is yours" blimp, a recurring motif that floats above Miami's skyline and eventually hovers over Tony's mansion. Most viewers see it as simple irony. Tony wants the world, but can't keep it. But according to production notes and commentary from the cinematographer, the blimp is more than that. It's a ghost, a floating symbol of the lie that drove him. In early drafts of the script, that phrase appeared in dialogue as well, often from characters who never achieved their dreams. By the time it appears above Tony's house, it isn't a promise, it's a curse. F. Murray Abraham, who played Omar Suarez, once remarked that Scarface is not a movie about drugs or crime, it's a movie about fragility. Every major character is fragile in some way. Omar hides his fear with bravado. Elvira hides her sadness with coldness. Manny hides his loneliness with charm. And Tony? He hides everything with violence. Abraham said he approached his character not as a gangster, but as a man constantly calculating risk, trying to stay relevant, trying not to get erased. That anxiety, not the money or the guns, is what binds the characters together and what ultimately destroys them. Even the architecture of the film reflects decay. The locations shift from vibrant, crowded spaces, clubs, restaurants, city streets, to increasingly isolated and sterile environments. By the final act, Tony's entire world consists of three things: a mansion, a pile of cocaine, and a phone. The cast and crew have said that this narrowing of space was deliberate. It's the visual equivalent of a noose tightening. The wider the world becomes outside Tony's gates, the smaller his personal world becomes inside them. He wins the war for territory, but loses the war for connection. And when it all comes crashing down, it doesn't happen in silence. It happens in a ballet of bullets, blood, and screams. The final shootout is legendary, and yet, within the chaos, there's a quiet tragedy. Tony doesn't run. He doesn't beg. He barely even flinches, because by that point, he knows what's coming. In behind-the-scenes commentary, Pacino said he approached that final scene not as a death, but as a kind of suicide. Tony had been pushing the world away piece by piece, burning every bridge, destroying every bond. By the time the bullets come, he's not fighting to live. He's just refusing to surrender. After Tony's body hits the water of his own indoor fountain, after the camera pulls back and the house falls silent, something subtle happens. The statue, the one that reads, "The world is yours," remains perfectly intact, staring down at the wreckage. It's the last thing the audience sees before the fade to black. According to the set decorators and assistant directors, that wasn't just a prop. It was meant to be a final statement. The world is yours, until it isn't, until the very thing you chase consumes you. And once it does, all that's left is marble and myth. Years after the film's release, Al Pacino reflected on the character of Tony Montana with a mixture of pride and regret. He acknowledged that the performance changed his career, but he also admitted it haunted him. Not because of what Tony did, but because of what the world did with him. He said Tony was a warning, not a role model, a man who mistook fear for respect, power for freedom. And yet, posters of Tony Montana still hang in dorm rooms and barbershops. His face has become a brand, stripped of context. Pacino never blamed the audience, but he often wondered if they saw the real Tony, or just the swagger. Michelle Pfeiffer has been even more candid. She said in interviews that she struggled to watch the film after its release, not because of the violence, but because of how close it hit to her own insecurities at the time. Elvira's emptiness wasn't just a character trait, it was something she pulled from her own life. She saw herself in the cold detachment, in the way Elvira numbed herself to survive. And yet, over time, she's come to see the role as a turning point, a moment when she realized the cost of chasing an image instead of truth, both on screen and off. And what about the fans? The ones who never caught the deeper layers? The cast has always had mixed feelings. On one hand, they're grateful. The film lives because of the people who quote it, who wear the shirts, who pass the myth down like legend. But on the other hand, there's sadness. Because buried under the guns and the grime is a story about the human cost of ambition, about identity, about fear. And most viewers, they say, never dig deep enough to find it. They see Tony's rise, but not his rot, his style, but not his sickness. The real tragedy of Scarface isn't that Tony dies, it's that no one learns from his death. In the end, Scarface remains what it always was, a mirror, a reflection of the times it was made in, and the world we still live in. It asks what happens when a man is told he can have everything, but isn't shown how to value anything. It's about what you lose when you try to become a god in a world built for mortals. And perhaps, most haunting of all, it's a film that dares to whisper a truth we rarely want to hear, that sometimes chasing the dream is the fastest way to destroy it.